Hey everybody, my name is Maxwell Bernardi. This is my book review channel. I'd like to do a couple different kinds of videos with this channel. I'm hoping to eventually start making some longer videos talking about my favorite authors and comparing their work across their bibliography. And I'd like to do some work with nonfiction books, particularly, I'm a big history reader, and so kind of talking about history books that I think are interesting and kind of how they compare to the modern world and their connection with each other, different authors, perspective on contemporary issues, and of course, just generally talking about fiction. So I thought I'd start off my channel with this first video just talking about the novels I read in April. Read 6 novels in April. Most of them enjoyed quite a bit. I did a bit of rereading that month. So yeah, hope you enjoy. So the first novel I'd like to talk about is American Psycho by Bret, Easton, Ellis. Most people are familiar with the movie. I am familiar with the general tone of the movie from kind of the cultural osmosis. I've never actually seen it, so this is my first exposure to the work. I enjoyed this book a lot. I read it in about a week. It really captured my attention quite profoundly. The book starts with a quote from Notes from Underground by Fyodor Dostoevsky, and please excuse my terrible Russian pronunciation. And I think that's a great allusion to Dostoevsky because this book, much like Notes from Underground and a lot of other great works by that author, is a very intimate psychological sketch. In Dostoevsky's case with Notes from Underground, it's a very particular kind of Russian figure from his time. In the case of American Psycho, it's a very contemporary American figure of the time the book was written, the early 90s. Patrick Bateman, the main character, is this serial killer who's a hedge fund manager, and a lot of the jokes and kind of humor of the book has to do with the kind of soullessness of that world, of the high finance world, and how that soullessness and apathy that it breeds, in this case, in this very heightened kind of uncanny, almost psychedelic world of the book, in which Bateman as the narrator is becoming increasingly unhinged from reality and we don't know what is real and what isn't. That context, that kind of morally devoid world, allows him to get away with quite literally the worst possible things a person can be doing. I mean, he's raping women, horribly dismembering them, eating them, blinding a homeless person at one point. It's very disturbing, and the book can be quite hard to read because the depictions of violence are so explicit, and Ellis is a very good writer, but when you're a very good writer and you write violence, sometimes as a reader it's hard to take. I know this book is quite controversial because of the very, very prevalent theme of like violent misogyny within it. And while I do understand why that's a turnoff for a lot of people, personally I think that the book is quite clearly a satire on people like Bateman, and his misogyny and his violence is one of the many things about him which is intended to signify just how morally repugnant he is. He's the most unlikable man in the entire world. There is nothing redeeming about him. From the little things, like the fact that just on a personal level, he's a total asshole, and he's a total classic kind of rich guy asshole, which the hedge fund manager type is very indicative of. And then on the other, obviously the most extreme case of being a horrible serial killer. Like I said, he's very much a classic kind of example of an unreliable narrator. The book, especially near the end, becomes very kind of stream of consciousness and unhinged. There's a lot of drug abuse within the book, so it's not really clear like what is he actually doing versus what is his own imagination. And I think it all really works well. I think Ellis takes a very intimate psychological sketch and merges it with very contemporary kind of stream of consciousness style writing, and I think he pulls it off in a way that not many authors would be able to. So yeah, I would highly recommend American Psycho. Like I said, I haven't seen the movie. I'd like to watch it, having read the book rather. And I would rate it 8.5 out of 10. Really excellent. I will definitely reread it at some point. Enjoyed it quite a bit. The next book I read this month, or rather last month, was Last Exit to Brooklyn by Hubert Selby Jr. This was a reread. One of my favorite books ever. Doesn't quite have the same pop because this is the third time I've read it. I think that can be expected for any book. But Last Exit to Brooklyn, really brilliant writing. If you haven't read it, it's a series of vignettes about kind of lower class, seedy underworld life in Brooklyn in the kind of late 40s, early 50s. The characters range from these kind of transgender prostitutes who are also drug dealers / addicts themselves. There's characters who are just kind of working men and working women who are kind of caught up in just the cycle of, I guess, just ignorant life. That's really what the theme of the book seems to me. And I think in different hands, it could come off as maybe condescending or almost hateful against poor people. But I think knowing Hubert Selby Jr. and his story, he was a heroin addict, he grew up in Brooklyn, and he really felt like these stories just kind of erupted out of him in his own lived experience. I think the book is a really important tribute to the pain and horrors of being in poverty and being in a criminal life or a life of kind of debauchery and the problems that can bring. But I think it also gives a lot of dignity to a lot of the characters, and ultimately I think it's a deeply moral plea and a deeply moral book about how the descent that many of the characters go through and the depths of negativity that they reach throughout the book is ultimately in their hands, and they made the wrong choice. But it's not quite a morality play. It's not quite designed to elicit some kind of obvious conclusion. I think it's supposed to be read as a tragedy more than anything else. Last Exit to Brooklyn was very controversial when it came out in the 60s. It was banned for quite a while, both because it depicts transgender and homosexual people, which was very contentious at the time. It depicts a lot of heroin and other drug use, which was also very contentious. And it's just generally can be a very disturbing book. I think it was part of a new breed of kind of unashamed, uncensored, raw look at the darkest sides of society. And as corny as that sounds to us in 2021, I think it has a lot of impact. Like I said, third time I've read it, still really enjoyed it. So I would rate it maybe 9 out of 10. I would highly recommend it. It's one of my favorite books ever. So yeah, check it out if you haven't read it before. It's worth your time. It's not very long. The prose can be a little hard to get used to as you first read it because it is quite unique. His style doesn't involve a lot of punctuation. It's very stream of consciousness. Once again, you may be picking up on the theme on the kind of writing I like. But yeah, worth the time of anyone who wants to really get into the great American literature of the last 60, 70 years. So the next book I'd like to talk about is Cherry by Nico Walker. I read this book because I saw the Tom Holland movie adapting the book recently came out. I became interested. I think Nico Walker was interviewed on a podcast I like recently. I was not terribly impressed with it, to be honest. I think the prose style is quite unique. I think Nico Walker's a talented writer, but it does kind of fall into a lot of the same stylistic and story traits that a lot of kind of addiction underworld stories have. The basic structure of the story, it's essentially autobiographical, kind of this teenage suburban fuck up, for lack of a better word, does a bunch of drugs, living his life, has a weird relationship with his girlfriend, goes to Iraq, fights in Iraq, sees all kinds of terrible things, comes back, him and his girlfriend get deep into heroin addiction, he starts robbing banks. The book, interestingly, essentially doesn't end. It just stops, and it doesn't address the fact that Nico Walker then was eventually arrested and wrote the book when he was in prison for robbing banks, which I think is a good choice. I think it gives the book a final flavor of originality in a way that if just ending with him being arrested would have been a little more textbook, a little more obvious. Like I said, his writing style is very good. It's very sparse, very engaging. I read this book in like 2 days. But I think the story itself, not terribly interesting. It's not anything new, which, what can be said? It's autobiographical, so real life is not as crazy and out there as fiction can be. But I think it does fall into a lot of the same traps that a lot of young male writers who are kind of talking about more seedy subjects like addiction get into, especially when it comes to women. Just a lot of weird, kind of misogynistic stuff. A lot of just kind of almost whining. I don't know. The perspective of this book can really be a turnoff, and he's a good enough writer to pull it off, but I think it's worth your time to read it, but only because it's quite short and it's quite easy to read. I don't think I'll ever read it again. I wasn't terribly impressed. I'd rate it maybe a 6 out of 10. But like I said, check it out from the library. Maybe don't buy it. The next book I read I enjoyed quite a bit more. This is Annihilation by Jeff VanderMeer. The first in a trilogy, though the 3 books, I've been told my girlfriend who read all 3 and suggested the first one to me, don't necessarily coincide with each other in a super strong way. If you've seen the movie adaptation of this book, the movie is quite different. The movie is more of a blend of all 3 books and then some original ideas. But the basic structure is the 4 main characters who are unnamed. They're named after their professions: the anthropologist, the psychologist, I believe it's biologist, and a 4th one who I can't remember right now. Obviously, I did a lot of research about this before I started filming. They are all sent into Area X, which is a part of the coastal area of Florida that's been overtaken by this sort of mysterious, alien-esque mutation that kind of turns the natural environment into these really bizarre, otherworldly animals. And the book is really incredible in how it's written. If you've ever read The Drowned World by G.G. Ballard, that was a book I read that I really did not like, but which I felt like Annihilation kind of scratched the same itch. It was what I wanted The Drowned World to be. The narration is really sparse and almost kind of inhuman. It's first person, but it's from the perspective of this person who has not super defined emotional capacity, and so she's a biologist, so she's observing the world in this kind of detached way, and it really adds to the tone of the overall piece. It's a really brilliant piece of sci-fi that truly captures you in this mode of being in a utterly foreign, different kind of an environment, an inhuman environment, a non-earthly environment. And the themes of the book, which have to do, I think, and how I read it, with kind of the inevitability of evolution and how should humans respond in the face of big, almost unstoppable processes like climate change or evolution or war, whatever you want it to be. Cancer is another big theme of the book. All of this really builds in this just very tight, it's almost, maybe 170 pages, really tight, really self-contained story. And yeah, it's almost hard to describe because so much happens, but also not that much happens. There's a lot of really brilliant ways in which VanderMeer talks about kind of psychedelic, ethereal ideas while also making it kind of clear what it is he's trying to talk about. I think it's a brilliant book. I really recommend it, especially if you're a sci-fi person. I have not read a lot of sci-fi, but this to me really was what I want out of sci-fi in general. So yeah, I would give the book 8 out of 10. Really, really brilliant, great sci-fi novel. Very short, so yeah, I would recommend it. Check it out. So the next novel I'll talk about is Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. I love this book. This is the second time I've read it, and on this time, I really decided after finishing it, it's probably my favorite novel I've ever read to this point. Blood Meridian is, in one sentence, it's an adventure story, a classic adventure story, turned on its head. It's a take on the American Western, which is profoundly nihilistic and dark, but which I think taps into something in the American soul and the American psyche, which is really unsettling and horrifying, but also viscerally real, and you can't take your eyes away. This is a 350-page book, and I just tore through it because it's so engaging. McCarthy's prose is so incredibly just visceral. I keep coming back to that word. The general story of Blood Meridian is about a character who's only known as the Kid, and he ages throughout the story. and he joins up with a group of Indian hunters, is what they call it, and they basically rage through northern Mexico and the southwest of the United States, just massacring native tribes, taking their scalps, selling it to the Mexican government. And it's a brutal book. I mean, it's starkly violent. There's just constant bloodshed, constant kind of this sense of being irredeemable. There's nothing pure or good in this world of the story. It's just pure evil, but it doesn't feel exploitative. It doesn't feel decadent. It's real. It's very earthy and physical, and you can feel the kind of momentum of the extermination campaign the characters are going through. And it's really much like American Psycho, even though the two books are extremely different. It's a story about a villain, and it doesn't try to make them heroes. Yeah, like I said, Cormac McCarthy's work in general, to me, really captures the soul of America, particularly the soul of the Southwest and the soul of kind of Americans, white Americans in contact with natives and in contact with Mexicans, and the conflicts that come from there, and kind of the beauty of that world, but also just the pure evil of colonialism and all the intricacies of that. And I think Blood Meridian, is the perfect example of that, but it works across all of his books that I've read, other than maybe The Road, because The Road is about something quite different. In the future, I would love to do a full video talking about the bibliography of Cormac McCarthy. He's one of my favorite authors. But suffice to say, to me at least, Blood Meridian is a perfect novel. I really would be hard-pressed to think of anything I'd like to change about it or that I think is flawed about it. From page 1 to the last page, I'm in. It sucks you in. And so, 10 out of 10. Couldn't recommend more. I'll read this book again. As soon as I put it away, I wanted to read it again. I have to resist the urge to reread Blood Meridian 50 times. It's brilliant. And then finally, to close out the video, the next book I read, I thought it was a novel, realized as I was reading it's a series of short stories, so I guess I'm cheating. But really enjoyed it. Tokyo Decadence by Ryu Murakami. Once again, excuse me, I only speak English, and so my pronunciation of things that are not English is shameful. But yeah, I enjoyed this a lot. It's actually kind of a smashing together of multiple short story collections of his, but it flows together quite well. He uses a lot of kind of thematic ties between his different stories, such as 3 stories in a row, which all feature the same character in the sense that he has the same background, but it's a different person, or 3 stories in a row, which all reference a certain baseball game, so you realize as you read them that all the characters are actually at the same baseball game, even though their lives are completely different and they don't know each other. And it really helps a lot. As kind of corny as that might sound, it's a really well put together collection. Each story is generally about people who are struggling with some kind of collapse of their social life or some kind of relationship troubles, but it's not super intense. This isn't Hubert Selby Jr. These guys aren't criminals or drug addicts or something. It's, there's characters that are prostitutes, but even that, it's treated in this very human, undramatic way. And a way that is really, I think, does the book a lot of justice in its understatedness, both in the prose and the way the stories are handled. I think it's a deceptively impactful book. It's not a book that I think flipping through it for the first time you would really register as being very heavy or going to stay with you. But I think about these stories, 3 weeks later, 4 weeks later quite often. And I was really impressed. I didn't know really anything about the author. I kind of picked the book out at random, and I would like to read more novels of his. I think Tokyo Decadence is a great introduction to his work. So 7.5 out of 10, I would say. Recommend it. It's a solid read, and it's a quick read. So I'll do it. That was the fictional work I read for April. Read a little bit more, but it was all rereading stuff, and mostly things I would like to talk about more at length in longer videos about authors whose works across their whole bibliography I would like to examine. So please let me know what you think of the video. Let me know what you think of the books I reviewed. If there's something you'd like me to read and talk about in the future, please let me know. And thanks for checking this out.